The late autumn rain had turned Copper Creek into a raging torrent, its normally gentle waters now a churning mass of muddy fury that swept away everything in its path. The wooden bridge that connected the town of Millfield to the surrounding ranches creaked ominously under the assault of debris-laden water, but it still held firm against the flood's relentless push. It was from this bridge that they threw Rebecca Sinclair into the deadly current below. The mob had formed quickly, as mobs always did when fear and ignorance collided with the need for someone to blame. The cholera outbreak that had claimed 37 lives in Millfield over the past month needed an explanation that made sense to people who couldn't accept that. Sometimes death simply came without reason or justice. Rebecca, a newcomer to town, who worked as a midwife and herbalist, had made the fatal mistake of being different. She was too educated for a woman, too independent, too willing to challenge the local doctor's methods with her own knowledge of healing. When several of her patients recovered from illnesses that claimed others, whispers began about unnatural healing and devil's bargains. The final straw came when old Judge Morrison died, despite Dr. Whitman's treatment, while Martha Stevens, whom Rebecca had been secretly treating with herbal remedies, recovered completely. In the grief-stricken, fear-soaked atmosphere of a town losing its citizens to an invisible enemy, logic gave way to superstition, and superstition demanded sacrifice, which screamed Martha's own husband, Tom Stevens, his face twisted with the particular madness that comes from guilt and desperation. She cursed the judge and saved my wife to hide her evil. She's the reason the sickness keeps spreading. Dr. Whitman, whose pride had been wounded by Rebecca's success where his methods failed, nodded grimly. I've seen her gathering strange herbs by moonlight, mixing potions that no Christian woman should know how to make. The devil's work, mark my words. Sheriff Bradley, a weak man who governed by popular opinion rather than law, made no effort to protect Rebecca as the mob dragged her from her small cabin toward the swollen creek. Now folks, he called out half-heartedly, let's not do anything we'll regret. But his words were lost in the roar of angry voices and the drumming of rain on the wooden planks of the bridge. Rebecca had stopped struggling. Recognizing the futility of fighting against mass hysteria, she stood straight and dignified even, with her hands bound behind her back, her dark hair plastered to her head by the rain, her green eyes reflecting not fear, but a kind of resigned sadness for the ignorance of her accusers. Rebecca Sinclair, intoned Tom Stevens in his self-appointed role as judge and executioner, you stand accused of witchcraft, of bringing disease and death to our town through your unholy practices. The penalty for such evil is death by water, so that your wickedness may be washed clean and our town freed from your curse. I've hurt no one, Rebecca said quietly, her voice barely audible over the storm. I've only tried to heal, to ease suffering. If that's evil in your eyes, then your hearts are darker than any magic you imagine I possess. Her words only inflamed the crowd further. With a roar of righteous fury, they lifted Rebecca and threw her over the bridge railing into the churning waters below. Rebecca hit the water hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs and the cold shocking her system into near paralysis. With her hands bound, she couldn't swim, could barely keep her head above the surface as the current swept her downstream. Like a piece of debris, she caught glimpses of the mob on the bridge, their faces twisted with satisfaction and the terrible relief that comes from having someone to blame for incomprehensible tragedy. The water filled her mouth and nose as she went under for the second time, her heavy skirts dragging her down like anchors. Rebecca felt her consciousness beginning to fade, and found herself thinking not of her own impending death, but of the cruel irony that she who had dedicated her life to saving others would die because of their ignorance and fear. Then, just as the darkness began to close around her vision, strong arms wrapped around her waist and hauled her toward the surface. Rebecca's first coherent thought upon breaking the water's surface was that her rescuer must be an extraordinarily strong swimmer to have reached her so quickly in such treacherous conditions. Her second thought, as she felt herself being pulled steadily toward the riverbank, was that whoever had jumped in after her had done so without hesitation. She could hear the crowd on the bridge shouting in surprise and anger. Clearly not having expected anyone to interfere with their rough justice. The man who dragged Rebecca from the water was a stranger to her, though she had heard his name spoken in town, with the particular mixture of respect and wariness reserved for those who lived by their own rules. Caleb McKinnon owned the largest ranch in the territory, a sprawling operation that had made him wealthy enough to be independent and powerful enough to ignore social conventions when they didn't suit him. At 35, Caleb was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of hard physical work and harder decisions. His dark hair was now plastered to his skull by river water, and his gray eyes burned with a cold fury that made even the boldest members of the mob take an unconscious step backward. Caleb said nothing as he carried Rebecca to his horse, nothing as he cut the ropes that bound her hands, nothing as he wrapped her in his own coat and lifted her onto his saddle. The crowd on the bridge called out threats and accusations, demanding that he return the witch to face justice, but Caleb ignored them completely, mounting behind Rebecca and riding away without acknowledging their existence. "You're safe now," were the first words Caleb spoke, his voice low and reassuring as they rode through the storm toward his ranch. "No one will hurt you again." Rebecca, still shivering from cold and shock, found herself leaning back against his solid warmth, trusting in his protection with an instinct that surprised her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you save me? You don't even know me." Caleb was quiet for so long that Rebecca thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain and hard-earned wisdom. "Because I know what it's like to be condemned for things beyond your control," he said simply. "Because I've seen what fear and ignorance can do to good people when they're desperate for someone to blame. And because," he paused, seeming to struggle with words, "because sometimes the right thing to do is obvious, even when it's dangerous." As they approached the McKinnon ranch, Rebecca could see through the rain that it was a substantial operation, a large house built of local stone and timber, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. But more than the physical comfort it represented, the ranch felt like a sanctuary, a place removed from the madness and cruelty they had left behind in Millfield. "The townspeople will say you're harboring a witch," Rebecca warned as Caleb helped her down from his horse. "They'll turn their anger on you for protecting me." Caleb's expression didn't change as he considered her words. "Let them try," he said quietly. "I've been dealing with fools and bullies for most of my life. They don't frighten me." Inside the ranch house, Caleb's housekeeper, Maria Santos, took one look at Rebecca's bedraggled condition and immediately went into action, ordering hot baths and dry clothes and food while scolding Caleb in rapid Spanish for bringing home someone who was clearly in shock and exhaustion. "Segura," Maria said to Rebecca in accented but clear English, "you are safe here. Segura Caleb. He is a good man, a strong man. No one will hurt you in his house." As Rebecca soaked in the first hot bath she had enjoyed in weeks, letting the warmth seep into her chilled bones, she found herself marveling at the unexpected turn her life had taken. This morning she had been Rebecca Sinclair, midwife and healer, living quietly on the edges of a community that tolerated her services, while distrusting her methods. Tonight she was Rebecca Sinclair, accused witch and attempted murder victim, sheltering in the home of a man who had risked his own safety to save hers. But most remarkable of all was Caleb McKinnon himself, a man who had made the split-second decision to dive into a raging river to save a stranger, who had defied an angry mob without saying a word, who had offered her sanctuary without asking questions about her guilt or innocence. When Rebecca finally emerged from her room in borrowed clothes that Maria had provided, she found Caleb sitting by the fireplace in what was clearly his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "Feeling better?" he asked, gesturing to a chair across from him. "Much, thank you," Rebecca replied, settling gratefully into the comfortable chair. "Mr. McKinnon, I need you to understand something. The accusations against me, they're not entirely without foundation." Caleb raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I'm not a witch," Rebecca said quickly, "but I do practice forms of healing that most people don't understand. I use herbs and remedies that I learned from my grandmother. who learned them from her grandmother. Some of my methods work better than conventional medicine. And that frightens people. Are you saying you actually helped people recover from the cholera? Caleb asked, his tone carefully neutral. Some of them, yes, not all. I'm not a miracle worker. But my treatments seemed to be more effective than Dr. Whitman's. And in a town full of dying people, that made me either a saint or a devil. They chose devil. Caleb sipped his whiskey thoughtfully. And which would you say you are? Rebecca looked into his gray eyes, seeing neither fear nor judgment, only genuine curiosity. I'm a woman who learned to heal from people who understood that the natural world contains remedies that conventional medicine hasn't discovered yet. My grandmother was Cherokee, and she taught me things that have been forgotten by most of the world. That explains the unusual knowledge, Caleb said quietly. It doesn't explain why you're willing to risk your life to help people who clearly don't appreciate your efforts. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes at his understanding. Because healing is what I was born to do. Because every person who recovers, every life that's saved, justifies the risks and the persecution. At least it did until today. Caleb leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but kind. Rebecca, what happened today wasn't about your healing methods or your heritage. It was about fear making people cruel, about the need to blame someone when life becomes unbearable. You didn't deserve what they did to you. But now I'm a burden to you, Rebecca said quietly. They'll come here eventually, demanding that you turn me over to them. You've already done more than enough by saving my life. Caleb set down his glass and looked directly into her eyes. Rebecca Sinclair, let me make something clear. You're not a burden. You're a guest in my home for as long as you need or want to stay. And if anyone comes here making demands about what I do with my guests, they'll discover that I'm not as patient with bullies as some people might hope. As Rebecca looked into Caleb's determined face, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of being truly protected, not just physically but emotionally. This man who had pulled her from a river, without hesitation, was now offering her something equally precious, the chance to rebuild her life in safety, free from the fear and judgment that had driven her from town to town for most of her adult life. For the first time since hitting the cold water of Copper Creek, Rebecca Sinclair allowed herself to hope that her story might have a different ending than the one the mob had planned for her. What incredible courage from Caleb. Sometimes the most powerful actions are taken without a single word, just the immediate choice to do what's right. Rebecca's rescue is just the beginning of something beautiful. If you're feeling the emotion and power of this moment, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss how Rebecca and Caleb's story unfolds. Now, let's return to our tale and see how these two wounded souls will heal each other. In the weeks that followed Rebecca's rescue, a routine developed at the McKinnon ranch that surprised both of them with its natural ease. Rebecca, gradually recovering from her physical and emotional trauma, began to make herself useful around the house and ranch, applying her healing knowledge to both human ailments and animal injuries. Caleb, for his part, proved to be an ideal host, protective without being controlling, respectful of Rebecca's need for space and time to heal, and genuinely interested in learning about her unconventional methods of medicine and healing. Show me how you knew to use willow bark for the mare's inflammation, Caleb asked one morning as they tended to a horse that had been injured in a fall. Dr. Whitman would have just bled her and hoped for the best. Rebecca smiled as she prepared a poultice from ingredients she had gathered in the hills around the ranch. My grandmother taught me that the natural world provides remedies for almost every ailment, if you know how to look for them. Willow bark contains the same healing properties that reduce fever and inflammation in humans. Caleb watched with fascination as Rebecca's skilled hands worked to prepare the treatment, noting the obvious expertise and care she brought to her healing work. How long have you been practicing this kind of medicine? Since I was 12 years old, Rebecca replied, gently applying the poultice to the mare's injured leg. My grandmother recognized that I had an intuitive understanding of healing, and she began teaching me everything she knew. When she died, I was the only one left who remembered her knowledge. That's an enormous responsibility for someone so young. Rebecca's expression grew thoughtful as she secured the bandage around the mare's leg. It was But it was also a gift. Every person I've been able to help, every life I've saved or suffering I've eased, that knowledge has made it possible. Over the following days, word began to spread throughout the territory about the remarkable healer staying at the McKinnon ranch. Ranch hands and neighboring families who had heard about Rebecca's abilities began to arrive seeking help for ailments that conventional medicine had failed to address. At first, Rebecca was reluctant to treat anyone, still traumatized by the accusations of witchcraft that had nearly cost her life. But Caleb encouraged her to resume her healing work, pointing out that the people coming to seek her help were clearly desperate and willing to risk social disapproval to find relief. "These people need you, Rebecca," Caleb said as they watched. A ranch hand's infected wound heal rapidly under Rebecca's care. "And you need to be doing the work you were born to do. But what if word gets back to Millfield? What if they come looking for me again?" Caleb's expression hardened. "Let them come. They'll find that harassing my guests is not a wise decision." Indeed, Caleb's reputation for being a man who shouldn't be crossed served as a powerful deterrent to anyone who might have been inclined to cause trouble for Rebecca. His ranch was like a small kingdom where his word was law, and everyone in the territory understood that crossing Caleb McKinnon came with serious consequences. As autumn turned to winter, Rebecca's informal medical practice grew steadily. She treated everything from difficult childbirths to chronic illnesses, often achieving results that amazed both patients and their families. More importantly, she began to regain the confidence and sense of purpose that the witch trial had shattered. "You're different now," Caleb observed one evening as they sat by the fire in his study, sharing their customary after-dinner conversation. "When you first arrived here, you were like a wounded animal, alert and defensive, ready to run at the first sign of danger. Now you seem settled." Rebecca looked up from the medical journal she had been reading, one of several that Caleb had ordered from Denver to help her stay current with developments in conventional medicine. "I feel safe here," she said simply. "For the first time in years, I feel like I can be myself without fear of persecution or judgment." "This is your home for as long as you want it to be," Caleb said quietly. "I hope you know that." Rebecca studied his face in the firelight, noting the sincerity in his gray eyes and the way he always seemed to know exactly what she needed to hear. "Caleb, why have you been so kind to me? I know it's not just because you felt sorry for me." That day at the river, Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if weighing his words carefully. "Because I recognize something in you that I've seen in myself," he said finally. "The experience of being judged for things you can't control, of being treated as dangerous or different because you don't fit into other people's narrow definitions of acceptable behavior." "What happened to you?" Rebecca asked gently. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, and Rebecca could see that she was asking him to share something painful. "My father was a gambler and a drunk who lost our family ranch in a poker game when I was 16. My mother died of shame and heartbreak within a year. I spent the next 10 years working other men's land, saving every penny, learning everything I could about ranching and business." He paused to sip his whiskey before continuing. "When I finally had enough money to buy this place, I was 28 years old and harder than I should have been at that age. The good people of Millfield didn't trust me because I'd come from nothing and made my fortune too quickly. They whispered that I must have cheated or stolen to accumulate so much wealth so young." Rebecca felt her heart clench with sympathy for the young man Caleb had been, struggling to overcome his father's failures while facing suspicion and judgment from the community. He was trying to join. They weren't entirely wrong to be suspicious. Caleb continued with a bitter smile. "I wasn't always scrupulous in my business dealings during those early years. I was so determined to never be poor and powerless again that I sometimes bent the rules to get what I needed. But you succeeded honestly in the end," Rebecca pointed out. "Eventually." "Yes, but by then the damage was done. I was the outsider, the man who didn't quite belong, who couldn't be trusted despite his wealth and success." Sound familiar? Rebecca understood now why Caleb had been so quick to defend her, why he had risked his own standing in the community to protect someone he barely knew. He recognized in her story an echo of his own struggle against prejudice and narrow-minded judgment. "We're both outsiders," Rebecca said softly. Both of us judge for things that make us different rather than dangerous. Exactly. And maybe that's why Caleb trailed off, seeming to reconsider whatever he had been about to say. Why what? Rebecca prompted gently. Caleb turned to look directly at her, and Rebecca saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. Maybe that's why I find myself caring about you, in ways that go beyond simple hospitality or shared experience. Rebecca felt her breath catch at his words. Over the months she had been living at the ranch, she had become increasingly aware of Caleb as a man rather than just her rescuer and protector. She had noticed the strength in his hands when he worked with the horses, the kindness in his voice when he spoke to his employees, the way his presence made her feel safe and valued in ways she had never experienced before. Caleb, she said carefully, what are you saying? I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Rebecca Sinclair. Caleb replied simply. I love your intelligence, your courage, your dedication to healing others despite the personal cost. I love the woman who survived being thrown in a river and came out stronger instead of broken. Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes at his honest declaration. I love you too, she whispered. I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, because I didn't want to presume that your kindness meant something more than charity. Caleb reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his. Rebecca, nothing about my feelings for you has anything to do with charity. You're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known, and I would be honored if you would consider sharing your life with mine. Are you proposing to me? Caleb McKinnon, Rebecca asked, her voice trembling with emotion. I am, Caleb said, firmly. I'm asking you to marry me, not because you need my protection, but because I need your love. I'm asking you to be my partner in everything, in running this ranch, in building a life together, in facing whatever challenges the future might bring. Rebecca looked into Caleb's sincere gray eyes and saw her entire future reflected there, a future filled with love, respect, and the freedom to be exactly who she was without fear or apology. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears of joy. Yes, Caleb, I will marry you. I will be your partner and your wife, and I will love you for the rest of my life. When Caleb kissed her for the first time, Rebecca realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with someone making the split-second decision to dive in and save a stranger. Caleb had rescued her from drowning, but in doing so, he had also rescued them both from loneliness and given them the chance to build something beautiful together. As they held each other by the firelight, Rebecca marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been thrown into a river to die, but instead she had been reborn into a life filled with love, purpose, and the kind of acceptance she had never dared to dream possible. Sometimes, she reflected, the worst things that happen to us are actually the beginning of the best things that will ever happen to us. The wedding of Rebecca Sinclair and Caleb McKinnon took place on a crisp spring morning, 6 months after her rescue from Copper Creek, in the garden behind the ranch house where Rebecca had planted herbs that now flourished under her careful tending. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by the ranch hands who had become like family, neighboring ranchers who respected Caleb's character, and patients whom Rebecca had healed, and who had come to witness the happiness of the woman who had given them back their health. Notably absent were any representatives from Millfield, though word of the wedding had certainly reached the town that had tried to murder the bride. The absence didn't trouble either Rebecca or Caleb. They had built their happiness, independent of others' approval, and they saw no reason to seek validation from people whose judgment had proven so spectacularly flawed. Do you, Caleb McKinnon, take Rebecca Sinclair to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and to cherish, to protect and to honor, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, Caleb said firmly, his eyes never leaving Rebecca's radiant face. And I promise to stand with you against any storm, to defend your right to heal and help others, and to love you not despite your differences, but because of everything that makes you extraordinary. And do you, Rebecca Sinclair, take Caleb McKinnon to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and to cherish, to support and to honor, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Rebecca's voice rang clear and strong as she gave her answer, I do. And I promise to share my gifts freely with our community, to stand beside you in building something beautiful and lasting, and to love you for the courage you showed when you dove into dark waters to save a stranger. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed by a gathering that understood they were seeing something rare and precious to people who had found perfect understanding and acceptance in each other despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges they had both faced. The reception that followed showcased Rebecca's integration into the community that had formed around the McKinnon Ranch. She had become the unofficial doctor for everyone within a 50-mile radius, treating ailments that ranged from difficult childbirths to chronic pain to injuries that conventional medicine couldn't heal. Mrs. McKinnon saved my son's life when he had the lung fever, said Sarah Martinez, a neighbor whose family had ridden 20 miles through a blizzard to seek Rebecca's help. The previous winter, the doctor in town said there was nothing to be done, but she knew exactly what herbs to use. She delivered my daughter when the baby was coming backwards, added Tom Patterson, a ranch hand whose wife had nearly died in childbirth before Rebecca intervened. Both my wife and baby would have died without her. The stories continued throughout the evening, testament after testament to Rebecca's skill, compassion, and dedication to healing others. But more than that, they were evidence of how completely she had been accepted by this community that valued results over superstition, competence over conformity. As the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, Rebecca and Caleb sat together on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Rebecca wore a simple but elegant dress of deep green that brought out her eyes, while Caleb had traded his working clothes for a suit that emphasized his tall, strong frame. Mrs. McKinnon, Caleb said, testing out her new name with obvious pleasure. How does it feel to be a married woman? It feels like coming home, Rebecca replied, leaning against his shoulder. For the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere completely, like I don't have to hide any part of who I am. And how does it feel to have the entire territory singing your praises as a healer? Rebecca smiled at the question. It feels like vindication. All those years of being called a witch, of being driven from town to town, of being afraid to practice my calling openly, it's all been worth it to reach this point where I can help people without fear. Indeed, Rebecca's reputation as a healer had grown far beyond the McKinnon Ranch. People traveled from as far as Denver to consult with the woman who could cure ailments that had baffled other doctors. She had even begun training other women in her methods, passing on her grandmother's knowledge to a new generation of healers. There's been talk, Caleb said carefully, of building a proper medical clinic in the area. With you as the head physician, the territorial governor himself has expressed interest in supporting such a venture. Rebecca turned to look at him with surprise. Are you serious? A real clinic? With official recognition? Completely serious. Your methods work, Rebecca, and people are beginning to understand that healing knowledge comes in many forms. The old prejudices are giving way to practical results. As they discussed the possibilities for the clinic and their future together, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line beyond the house. Tom Stevens, one of the leaders of the mob that had thrown Rebecca into the river, had ridden out from Millfield with revenge on his mind and a bottle of whiskey for courage. The irony that his own wife had been secretly treated and saved by Rebecca was lost on Tom, whose guilt over his role in the near murder had festered into resentment and blame. In his alcohol-soaked reasoning, all of Millfield's problems could be traced back to Rebecca's survival and the unnatural influence she was gaining in the territory. But as Tom crept closer to the house, planning some vague form of violence that would restore his sense of righteousness, he found himself face to face with Caleb McKinnon, who had noticed the intruder long before Tom realized he'd been spotted. Stevens, Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded explosive violence. You're trespassing on my property. I suggest you leave immediately. Tom, emboldened by whiskey and self-righteousness, sneered at Caleb's warning. I've come for the witch, McKinnon. She's poisoned this whole territory with her devil's medicine. And it's time someone finished what we started at the river. Caleb's expression didn't change. But something in his stillness made Tom take an involuntary step backward. "Stevens, you tried to murder my wife once. I strongly advise against attempting it again." "Your wife?" Tom spat. "You married that house spawn, McKinnon. She's corrupted you too. Made you forget your Christian duty." Tom never finished the sentence. Caleb's fist connected with his jaw with the force of a sledgehammer, dropping the intruder to the ground in a heap. When Tom struggled to his feet, he found himself looking down the barrel of Caleb's Colt .45. "Now you're going to listen very carefully," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're going to get on your horse and ride back to Millfield, and you're going to tell everyone there that Rebecca McKinnon is under my protection. If anyone else comes to my ranch with violence in mind, they won't be riding home to deliver any messages." Tom, suddenly sober and acutely aware of how close he had come to death, stumbled toward his horse without another word. As he rode away into the darkness, Caleb called out one final warning. "And Stevens, if I hear that you or anyone else has been spreading lies about my wife, I'll come to Millfield personally to discuss the matter. You won't enjoy that conversation." Rebecca, who had watched the entire confrontation from the porch, came down to stand beside her husband as Tom's hoofbeats faded into the distance. "Will there be more trouble?" she asked quietly. Caleb holstered his gun and put his arm around her shoulders. "Not if they're smart. Word will spread about what happened here tonight, and most people will understand the message. And if they're not smart," Caleb's smile was grim but reassuring, "then they'll learn that some people are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." Years later, when Rebecca's clinic had become famous throughout the territory, and her methods were being taught in medical schools back east, people would still tell the story of the day Caleb McKinnon dove into Copper Creek without a word, to save a woman he didn't even know. But those who knew them well understood that the rescue was just the beginning of their story. The real miracle was how the people who had been rejected and judged by conventional society had found in each other the acceptance and love that allowed them both to flourish. Rebecca had saved countless lives with her healing knowledge, but Caleb had saved her life twice, once from drowning, and once from the despair of believing she would never find someone who could love her exactly as she was. "Do you ever regret diving into that river?" Rebecca asked Caleb one evening as they sat on their porch, watching their own children play in the yard, where she had once planted her first healing herbs. Caleb looked at his wife, this remarkable woman who had brought purpose and joy to his life in ways he had never imagined possible, and smiled. "Never," he said simply. "Best decision I ever made without thinking about it first." Rebecca laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like a promise that some love stories begin with split-second decisions to do what's right, regardless of the consequences. They had both learned that sometimes the most important actions are taken without words, without hesitation, without considering the cost. Sometimes you just have to dive in and trust that love will guide you to the surface, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, the person you save will turn out to be the one who saves you right back.